So we're going to be taking a look at a few different methods of making coiled handles. And so the most common way that you see potters make handles is using the pulling technique, which I've demonstrated for you prior. But another very acceptable and interesting method is to use coils or snakes or ropes of clay. So to do this, to do a couple of different variations of this technique, of course, I'm going to need clay. I have a container of water, a sponge, and a surgical towel, the typical things that I always have handy. And then I have a piece of plywood. You can see it has the different layers sandwiched in here. It's not the particle board. I like this because this is finished on one side, so this has a little bit of a sheen to it on one side. Then the other side is unfinished. And so I'm going to be starting on the unfinished side of the board because this is hydrophilic and the clay won't stick to it. Additionally, it will get it to dry out a little bit better. So I'm going to first clean my surface, and it'll dry very quickly because my sponge is not wet, it's just slightly damp. Then the next thing that I want to do, I've been working with clay a little bit here, so if I look at my hands, they're really dry. There's some powdery remnants of clay on there. The first thing that I'm going to do is a habit that I have, and it really extends the length of time that I can work with my clay. So I take my fingers and I just dip them into the water, and then I rub the water into my hands as though it were like a lotion. And so, of course, we know the clay remnants are still on my hands, but it actually creates a little barrier of moisture that will keep the clay from drying out, which is really important when you're working with when you're working with coils. So I will do this from time to time after I clean my hands. So the first thing that I want to show is if you're going to be making multiple handles, because I know that when you're making a set of pieces and they all need to have the same or very similar sized and shaped handles, it can be tricky to replicate. So this clay has already been wedged, and I just kind of squeezed it into a little bit of a sausage form so that it's easier for me to access the clay in same or similar size chunks. So I'm going to tear off 3 pieces of clay that are pretty relative in size, and I'll just set this aside over here. And so I'm going to make 3 handles. Now I will tell you that, and again, my hands are getting kind of dry, so I'm going to use a little bit of moisture. I'll tell you that it's a good idea to make extras. So if you need 3 handles, make 5. If you need 1 handle, make 3. It's just the best thing to make sure that you have something to choose from. So now that I have my pieces, what I'm going to do is I will roll a coil. And so first I have this rough edge. I'm going to just kind of address the rough edge so it doesn't fold over on itself later, and I have more of the clay that I can use. And I'm going to start by rolling the clay between my hands. And when I do this, I want to make sure that the coil of clay rolls completely around 360 degrees, as opposed to just forwards and backwards, because that's how the coil will get flat. So now that I've initiated this, I'm going to continue this process with the other pieces. Whatever step I do on one piece, I'm going to do on the other 2. And this is what I recommend you do. So see, I didn't finish the edge on this one and how it's all folded over versus this one. So this one actually will have some loss that I'll have to cut off later, which I don't want to do if I want the handles to be the same size and the same shape and all of that. So I'm going to address the end really quickly, just like you would on a pinch pot. The same thing on the other side. And then make sure the coil rolls completely around. So I've got 3, and I could see this one is actually lacking a little bit of clay. This one's a little bit heavy, so I'm going to tear some off. Any adjustments you do now will help your end product be more similar. Okay, so now that I've got my 3, I am going to roll them into tapered coils. So to roll the coils, first I want to make sure my surface is clean, because any protrusions that I have on my work surface will indent my clay unintentionally. So when I'm rolling, I'm going to start from my fingertip, and I'm going to roll the clay all the way back to the middle of my hand. This is going to assure that the clay rolls completely around. And I'm going to roll a tapered coil, meaning I want one end to be thinner than the other. And I'm not really pushing down, I'm just using the weight of my hands. Of course, the size in regards to the width of the handle, as well as the length, will really be determined by the piece that you're attaching it to. So that's a good start for me, and then I will roll the other 2. Now I've got my 3 coils rolled, and I'm going to show you 3 different techniques in making coil handles using tapered coils. Again, they're tapered, meaning they're wider at one end than the other. So if I were going to be copying or replicating my handles, I would want to do every step to each piece of clay before I move on to the next step. But for this demonstration, I'm going to show you 3 different techniques. But you can see that they're all the same length currently, although there will be some waste on the end for how I rolled it. So the first possible handle technique I wanted to show you is just a thrown handle. So I just pick up the clay like this, and whoops, with some attitude, I actually just throw it down onto the slab of wood so that I have a slightly flattened surface. Contrary to what people may think about with handles, handles do not function very well if they are round, because your hand will actually twist around the handle. So it's important to have some sort of flattened edge, 1 or 2 or even 4, just to make sure that the hand has a place to rest. So I could stop here and make my handle, but there's other things that you can do too. I like to flatten both sides. And instead of just throwing it down again onto the wood, I can throw it down onto a texture. So if I set this aside, I have this fabric here. I love this fabric. It works really well. It makes kind of like an interesting repetitive texture. And so I can take that, and I want to make sure it doesn't move too much. And again, instead of throwing my coil down onto the wood, I can throw it down onto this texture and have it take an impression. And so when I pick it up, you can see it has an interesting impression. And then I have my other edge already too. And so from here, I can make a handle where this would be either the inside or it could be the outside, depending on what my specific aesthetic is all about. So from this point in making a handle, I think I would like this to be the inside of the handle, just as kind of like an interesting surprise. If you think of the overall shape of a handle, how it curls and touches the cup body is very important to consider. So while thinking of handles, we'll look at a mug that has a handle. This is by artist Alex Thomrule, and it's a really beautiful, very comfortable mug, and you can see like how ergonomic it is. You want to put your hands in all sorts of interesting places that are designed for it. But if we look specifically at the handle, you can see how it's attached. Of course, it's attached in 2 places, and it's also important to think about the strength of the attachment. So instead of attaching just the tip of the handle to the cup body, Alex actually attached the entire edge, the outside edge, to the cup body. And additionally, you can see that this part at the bottom is actually significantly thicker than the top part. That being said, this is just one way to make a handle. You could instead flip it around where the thick part is up at the top and then the thin part is down at the bottom. You can also do all sorts of different textured things to the handles. You can make it more angular, you can make it more rounded. But what I wanted to demonstrate here was exactly when you're attaching a handle, you have to think about how it will touch the cup body or whatever your vessel form is. So in this particular circumstance, what we're going to do is we're actually going to be cutting a beveled edge so that there is a clean surface to attach to the cup body. So this is the part that will be, of course, the thicker part. It could be the top or the bottom, depending on how you want to do it. And I'm going to cut it at a slight angle, like so. And I encourage you to play around with this. Then I'm going to just kind of address this edge so I don't have to do it later when it's attached to the cup. And then I could do the same down here if I wanted to, or I could leave it unaddressed, such as how Alex handled this. So now, again, there's innumerable things that you can do, but the whole idea is how the handle curves around to become a home for your hand to rest while the vessel form is being used. So it could take any number of shapes, perfectly round, it could be elongated, any number of things. But when I'm making handles, I do find it very useful to actually prop them up on the unfinished side of the board so that they can start to set up and they can start to dry a little bit while I'm making the other handles. And so I'm going to just flatten this edge a little bit. My fingertip is really clean, and that really fine layer of dust sediment is protecting the texture that I have on the handle as well. So it actually has a unique ridge to it that could make it more comfortable to hold, and it also adds a visual element. So a tapered coil handle with a little bit of texture. That's one option. Another option is, and I do usually like to flatten it just so that I have a defined place to work. Another thing that I like to do is create another surface. So I can just roll a brayer over the top. I'm not really pressing down. I'm just using the weight of the tool. And so that actually made this flat. Instead of 3 edges, it has 4 edges. And then I can think about other tools that I have that can make textures. So you have a potter's rib, and this is very similar to that tool. It's just a wooden circle. And so I can take it and I can press it into the handle to make different decorative embellishments. And so, of course, that could be on the inside or the outside. Your potter's rib works brilliantly for this. So I could create a handle like that. I usually do like to do something on the inside as well. And so I could repeat the motif or do something completely different. But think about the connection of the hand to whatever is using the hand, to the hand to the object that is being handled, whatever it is, whether it's a pitcher or a cup or a teapot. So I cut that also at an angle. And so maybe I attach it like this, and maybe the handle is something more like this. But you have to think about how the hand will interact with the handle. You need it to be thoughtful and comfortable. Please also note that if you leave little things stick up off from the main body of the vessel, they are at risk for breakage. So try to keep them compact and not too thin so that they don't break. So that's a different sort of handle, a little bit more playful, less structured. And then another thing that you need to think about when you're actually setting your handles up to dry is that they need to be vertical, straight up and down, so that whatever they attach to, you don't have the top part of the handle attached further to the left than the bottom. Unless, of course, that is your own stylistic decision. And if you're choosing to do something like that, that's cool. Just make sure to really emphasize it so it becomes apparent that that's what you are trying to do. Another method of making a coil handle that I like to use, so I flatten it first. This is actually a technique that I use on some of my cups right now that have handles and teapots. So I'm taking my brayer and I'm rolling it on one edge, and then I'm rolling it on the other edge. I just had to turn it so you could see. I could throw this down to get this ridge, but I want to make sure that it's actually in the middle instead of just crossing my fingers and hoping for the best, because when you throw stuff down, you can't aim it very well. So after I do this, something that I like to do is actually cut the handles apart and then reassemble them. So now I'm going to cut this in the reverse. So prior to this, I've been cutting into the coil. Now I'm cutting away from the coil. And I'm going to cut again. And I'm going to cut again. This is just a modified version of it. And so what I like to do then is rotate and attach these pieces together in different ways. Of course, I would score and slip them together, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to use a little bit of pressure to push them together. And this creates just a little bit of a dynamic change in the handle. And so this is just one method where I cut and change. Then I would need to address this center part as well. I would normally use a wooden tool to go in and press the connection to make sure that it's nice and firm. And then all you do is make sure that your handle's set up to a leather hard state, and then as long as they match the state of your vessel form that you're attaching them to, score and slip them very well at both the body of the vessel as well as the 2 points on the handles, and you should press firmly and hold, and they should be able to maintain a strong bond. Just make certain to not use greenware handles as handles, and don't use bisqueware handles as handles. Only after the piece has emerged from the final firing, when the clay is fired to the maximum temperature, is the handle safe to be used. So those are a couple techniques for coil handles.